Once upon a time, there was a boy named Max. Max wasn't like other boys. He had a wild imagination, and sometimes that imagination got the best of him. He could be loud, energetic, and playful. But more than that, Max loved to pretend. And when he put on his favorite wolf costume, everything around him seemed to change. One evening, Max decided to wear his costume. It was the most wonderful thing he owned. It had big, pointed ears, and a fluffy tail that swayed when he walked. He howled and growled, pretending to be a fierce wolf. Max loved the feeling of running around the house, causing chaos as he leaped from couch to couch. He even howled at the moon just like wolves do. But his mother, who was in the kitchen preparing dinner, didn't think Max's antics were very funny. "Max," she called sternly, "stop behaving like a wild animal." Max didn't listen. He continued his wolf-like behavior, running through the house with his arms outstretched, growling and causing trouble. The chairs were knocked over, and a vase nearly crashed to the floor. But Max didn't care. He was lost in his play, fully immersed in his imagination. His mother, who had had enough of the chaos, walked into the room and raised her voice. "Max," she said, her patience running out, "if you don't stop right now, I'll have to send you to your room." Max wasn't fazed by his mother's threats. With a defiant look on his face, he walked toward her and growled one last time. "I'm not going to stop," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm sending you to your room," his mother declared, her voice firm. And just like that, Max found himself alone in his room. His face was red, his body still filled with the energy of his wild imagination. He crossed his arms and pouted, feeling angry. "I'll show her," he muttered to himself. But as Max sat in his room, something strange began to happen. The walls around him started to grow taller and taller, stretching up into the sky. The room began to change, transforming before his eyes. The floor softened, becoming a patch of grass beneath his feet. The walls, once made of wood and plaster, were now towering trees, their branches reaching high into the air. The room had completely disappeared, replaced by a magical forest. Max looked around in awe. This wasn't his room anymore. He was no longer in his house. He was in a world filled with towering trees, whispering winds, and strange sounds. His heart raced, but it wasn't out of fear. Max felt a rush of excitement. Here, in this forest, anything was possible. He could be whoever he wanted to be. With a big smile on his face, Max began to walk through the forest, his footsteps soft against the lush grass beneath him. As he ventured deeper into the magical woods, he heard noises, growls, howls, and the rustling of leaves. Something was out there watching him. Suddenly, from behind a large bush, emerged a group of creatures. They were enormous, with sharp claws, glowing eyes, and huge mouths full of teeth. They looked frightening, but Max wasn't afraid. Instead, he stood tall, puffed out his chest, and stared them down. The creatures growled at him, their voices deep and rumbling. "Who are you?" one of them asked, its voice booming. Max stood his ground and replied, "I am the king of the wild things." The creatures blinked in surprise. They had never met anyone like Max before. They didn't know what to make of him. But after a moment of silence, one of the creatures stepped forward and said, "You're the king." Max nodded confidently. "Yes, I am. And I can show you how wild I can be." The wild things, intrigued and impressed by Max's bravery, agreed to follow him. And so, Max began to lead the wild things in a wild and crazy dance. They spun and twirled in circles, jumping up and down with joy. The creatures roared, laughed, and stamped their feet as they followed Max's every move. The whole forest seemed to come alive with energy and excitement. Max felt more alive than ever. For days, Max played with the wild things. They were his loyal followers, and he was their fearless king. He led them on adventures through the forest, creating games and building towering forts out of sticks and branches. They had wild feasts, eating wild food and making a lot of noise. Max had everything he could ever want: power, fun, and excitement. But over time, something began to change. Max noticed that Despite all the fun he was having, something was missing. He was surrounded by the wild things, but he didn't feel as happy as he thought he would. The more time he spent with them, the more he realized that he wasn't truly satisfied. One evening, while the wild things were busy playing, Max sat alone on a large rock, looking out into the forest. The sky above was filled with the colors of dusk, and the air had a cool, soft breeze. Max thought about how much fun he had, but he also began to feel a longing in his heart. He missed something. He missed the warmth of his home, the comfort of his own bed, and, most of all, he missed his mother. Max began to feel a strange sense of emptiness. He realized that being the king of the wild things wasn't enough. He didn't want to be alone in this wild land anymore. He wanted to go home, back to where he truly belonged. He walked over to the wild things, who were busy making noise and dancing around in the forest. "I have to go now," Max said softly, feeling a lump in his throat. "I want to go home." The wild things stopped their dancing and looked at Max with wide eyes. They didn't want him to leave. They had grown fond of their new king. They roared in protest, but Max smiled gently. "I have to go. I've had enough of being the king," Max said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I'll always remember you." The wild things were sad to see Max go, but they understood. They waved their large claws at him as he began to walk away. Max felt a pang of sadness in his heart, but he knew it was the right choice. As Max walked through the forest, the trees seemed to thin, and the sky grew lighter. The forest that had once felt vast and wild now seemed smaller, and before long, Max found himself back in his own room. The walls of his room were the same as they had been before, and the familiar furniture was in place. But Max didn't feel the same. He had changed. He heard a voice coming from downstairs. It was his mother. "Max," she called, "your dinner is waiting for you."